Welcome to Can You Just Sit With Me? Where I discuss hope in grief, hope in the hard place, and hope during the challenging times of life. I am your host, Natasha Smith. Thanks so much for joining me today. Hi there. Again, thanks so much for sitting with me today on this episode of Can You Just Sit With Me? I'm excited to fly solo once again, as I love on occasion to share pointed topics on grief throughout the year. And since we are in February now, the month of love, the topic for today is how to love the grieving well. So then the question becomes, how do we love the grieving well? And I'll give you a little hint. It all starts with what we say. Now, if you've been listening to the podcast thus far, you've heard episode after episode, guest after guest mention how grief is viewed similarly to mental health, kinda as an unspoken stigma, if you will. See, when someone's grief doesn't quite fit with social norms, and I say norms very loosely, those who grieve, they're seen and labeled as broken, like something is wrong with the person who is grieving. Often hearing something like, oh, you should be over it by now, or just move on, or in some shape, form, or fashion, just hurry up and get over it. When in fact, grieving is absolutely normal. It is universal, and it is the natural response to grief. Did you catch that? It is the natural response to grief, and you will hear me saying this over and over again until the whole world realizes this, that grief is absolutely normal. It's absolutely natural, because we will all grieve at some point in life, because it's a part of life. And the fact is, you and I most likely will come in contact with someone every single day who is grieving. And if you're listening to this episode even now, you are most likely grieving. Statistics show about 2.5 million people die in the United States annually, each leaving, on average, 5 grieving people behind. Now, that's a lot of people. So you see, I'm not alone in my grief, and neither are you. So this episode is about, again, how to love the grieving well, focusing on this, the things people say to those who grieve. So if I could title this episode, it would be, say this, not that. Because the Bible says to be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger in James 1:19. And it says this for good reason, because sometimes you and I, we can put our foot in our mouths when it comes to loving their grieving well, and really loving others in general. Because the thing is about grief, though, grief is uncomfortable, and it can be weird because we make it that way at times. Sometimes grief is hard, and it can be downright messy. And what I've found most often than not is many people want to express remorse. They want to extend comforting words, their condolences. They want to do or say something towards the loss, something to help ease the pain that a friend or loved one is experiencing due to some type of loss or any loss, but they simply do not know what to say. I mean, people have even told me before, and maybe they've told you, oh, I'm so sorry, I don't know what to say. So often times people just don't know what to say. So in an article called I Know They Meant Well by the Journal of Loss and Trauma, research was gathered on helpful and harmful messages extended to those who were grieving. The hurtful messages were found to be low in person-centeredness, meaning basically that they denied the other's feelings and perspectives by criticizing his or her feelings. So what happens is, in this case, is the focus is brought back to the sender, to the person who is speaking to the griever. For example, you may tell someone about your loss. Hey, I'm having a really hard time today because I lost my job. Or, hey, I'm having a really hard time today because I just lost my pet. And the person says, you know what? The same thing happened to me. Rather than saying, how are you doing? Or how are you feeling about that? See, at that moment, your feelings have been denied, and the focus has now shifted from what you are experiencing to what happened to the other person. And it does not feel good. I've had this happen to me on many occasions. For instance, after my nephew was murdered, I had someone ask what happened, which was to be expected to a degree, right? But it got to the point where the person just kept asking for more and more details, so much that I had to say, okay, I can't talk about it. It's under investigation. And I shouldn't not have had to have said this during this moment, right? But you see, at that moment and in this situation, the person was more interested in the details of what happened rather than asking, how are you doing during this traumatic time? And that was hurtful. Things like this are hurtful because it says, I care more about information than I care about you. So what we say matters. What we say to those who are grieving matters. And to love those who grieve well, we must be cognizant of what we say. Now, further in this article, I Know They Meant Well by the Journal of Loss and Trauma, 4 unsupportive message strategies were identified. The first one being distancing, where the person changes the subject or avoids the topic. Now, this is when someone who is grieving is sharing their loss, and the person in whom they're sharing it with basically just changed the subject on them. And then the second one is called bumbling. It's where the other person seeks to fix it, where they're trying to give a solution to the loss. The next one is minimizing, and it's basically when the person tries to cheer up the person. Oh, let's just go out, to grab a bite to eat so you don't feel sad. Or they use other platitudes for quote unquote getting over it. And then the fourth one is blaming. And this is where the person questions the griever's response to the loss. It doesn't take all of that, or you shouldn't be that upset about it. So those 4 things are 4 strategies of someone who is using unsupportive messages towards those who grieve. So it's distancing, bumbling, minimizing, and blaming. And you may have experienced any number of these in your grief. All are harmful, all are hurtful, and I'm so sorry that you have experienced this. I pray those who listen and will listen to this episode will feel seen and heard, those who are grieving. And then for those who know people who are grieving, I pray that you will take note and make some adjustments in the way that you interact and love on the grieving with your words. So what does a helpful message sound like? What should one say to someone who is grieving? First, all helpful messages must be more person-centered. Those who grieve value and long to be seen, heard, and understood. So when talking and speaking to someone who is grieving, acknowledge and validate the hurt and the pain of the loss, as well as give the griever the space and grace to grieve. James Petersen, in his book, Why Don't We Listen Better?, says his first rule of crisis is to listen first and to talk second. Because if you acknowledge people's fears, pain, losses, hurts, confusion, anger, etc. first, then they may calm enough to hear your thoughtful reassurances. Additionally, in his book, and I suggest everyone, meaning everyone on planet Earth, read this book, Why Don't We Listen Better? And so further, he says during times of grief, most need listeners instead of talkers. Like, can you just sit with me, right? We just need, most often, someone who will sit with us while we wait for God to do the work. So to close, I'd like to share 10 things called Say This, Not That. in order to help us to love those who grieve well with our words. So say this: you must be hurting. How are you doing? Instead of saying, I understand. Or say nothing, just listen. Instead of saying, at least they don't have to struggle anymore, or at least they're not suffering anymore. Say this: I'm so sorry for your loss. Instead of saying, you love them, but God loved them most. Or say this: I'm praying for you and your family. Instead of saying, God doesn't make mistakes. Or simply share a special memory. Instead of saying, at least they're not in pain anymore. Say this: I'm here for you. Instead of saying, don't cry. Or simply just show up. Instead of saying, be strong. Or say this: I don't know what to say, but I am thinking and praying for you and your family. Instead of saying, it must have been their time to go. Or offer to bring over food or run an errand. Instead of saying, everything happens for a reason. Or say this: I'm just here to sit with you. Instead of saying, they're in a better place now. So that is a wrap for this episode of Can You Just Sit With Me, on how to love the grieving well with our words, and just left you with a quick practical resource for 10 things that you can say this, not that. Hope you found it helpful and hope that you will share it with friends and family. Thanks so much for listening today. And be sure to come back for my next episode of Can You Just Sit With Me. Until then, this is Natasha Smith, helping you to find hope in grief, hope in the hard place, and hope in the challenging times of life. Be sure to connect with me across social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at I'm Natasha Smith.